Okay, Agriscience, let's finish up the plant science unit where you're going to be talking specifically about plant parts and their functions this time. We're going to start at the bottom of the plant. We're going to start in the ground with the roots. Typically, there are two different types of roots, and it kind of depends on the plant that you're talking about, what type of root that they have, what type of root system they have. You have fibrous roots, which is what you see here in this picture. This looks like some sort of a grass or forage crop, and you can see that these little roots are everywhere. These little root fibers are all over the place. Then there's also tap roots. Now, taproot is going to be normally when you have one major root, and you may have some root hairs that come off the side of it, but you have one major root. Think of things like carrots. You've got the leafy, pretty part above ground, but then the root, the carrot part, the part you're going to eat, is an actual tap root. So the whole function behind these roots is to help to anchor the plant in the ground, to keep it from blowing over or getting washed away. And it's also to take in water and nutrients. And so I kind of think about, it doesn't say it here, but they also are storage. And so I kind of think a lot of times about the root as being kind of like, something you would put in a root cellar. It's a way to store the nutrients that are taken up in the plant. Typically, what happens with a plant is water is going to be taken up through the roots, and then it's going to go up the stem into the leaves. They're going to photosynthesize, and they're going to send the nutrients back down, and those nutrients are going to stay in the roots. They're going to be stored there until the plant actually needs them. So the roots are kind of like the unseen heroes of the plant that are keeping it in place, and they're storing things for later on. Stems are kind of like the transportation system of the plant. You have different types of tissue that are going up and down in the plant. You have this tissue called xylem, and xylem is going to take water from the roots and it's going to go up the plant. So think about xi high, and we're going to go higher up into the plant. We're going to take that water up there. The water is going to go into the leaves. It's going to photosynthesize. It's going to create some sugars, and those sugars are going to be what feeds the plant. And then they're going to flow back down the phloem, which goes flow low, down into the roots, and it's going to be stored there. So whenever we're looking at stems, you have two basic types. You have woody stems, which are like trees and shrubs, and then you have herbaceous stems, which are those plants that are typically going to be more green, and they're going to have more water filled, and they're going to be more tender. They're going to support other plant parts, and again, they're that whole transportation system. The sugar is going to be made in the leaves. It's going to be transported through those stems and going to be stored down in the roots. The leaves themselves, these are kind of like the cafeteria of the plant. They're going to be what helps to provide the food for the plant. Now, obviously, you have to have supplies before you can start cooking. And so the roots and the stem are going to help to provide those supplies. They're going to help to bring the water up the plant. The plants are going to take in carbon dioxide that we breathe out. And they're going to use that water. They're going to use the carbon dioxide. The sunlight's kind of like the oven, and that oven is going to help to cook it, make it produce what it's supposed to, and your end product is going to be sugar, and it's going to be oxygen. So the oxygen is actually a byproduct. We're benefiting from the byproduct. So whenever we're looking at photosynthesis, we are specifically looking at taking water and carbon dioxide and turning it into a sugar that is usable for the plant and oxygen that we need. So all that happens while there's chlorophyll in the plant. The chlorophyll is what makes plants green. Now, in the fall and in the winter, whenever you don't have green plants, you really don't have a lot of photosynthesis going on because there's nothing there to produce that food. And so that's when those plants start pulling on those stores that have been left in the roots in order to help them survive the winter. And so we have to have that green chlorophyll. But whenever we get into the fall and the winter season, that's why the trees are starting to turn colors and lose their leaves, is because that plant is no longer photosynthesizing, and it's going to basically take the nutrients that is stored in its roots all summer and spring, and it's going to use those to help it get through the winter. The leaves are also really beneficial in helping us to be able to identify plants. For me, the first thing I look at whenever I'm trying to identify something is I look at the leaves first, and that's going to help me to figure out what something is. Somebody brought in a sample for me last week and said, "Can you tell me what this is?" And I looked at the flowers on it, and I said, "Well, it kind of looks like this, but I don't know that that would be blooming this time of year." And then I looked at the leaves, and it looked like maple leaves. And so, that's one of those things that um, I'm whenever I'm looking at something, the leaves are very, very beneficial. It turned out that what they were bringing me was actually a flowering maple, which I was not familiar with at all, but the leaves helped me figure out what it was. The flowers are going to be the reproductive part of the plant. Um, that's the sole purpose behind the flowers. Yes, they're pretty. Yes, they're supposed to smell good. Some smell good and some don't. But the whole purpose behind the flower is not necessarily the smelling and the prettiness. It's to make babies. And so you have the male part of the flower, which is the stamen. It's the anther and it's the filament. The filament is kind of like a little stalk, and on top of that stalk is going to be the anther, and that anther is going to contain pollen. So pollen is basically the male sex cell of the plant, and when that pollen blows off of the plant, or when it's washed off of the plant, or when it's carried off on the wings of an insect, then that pollen helps to spread the genetics of that plant throughout an area. The pollen is going to land on the female part of the plant. It's going to land on what we call the pistil. The pistil is the entire female part of the plant, but it has three different parts. The top part is sticky. The sticky stigma is going to be something that pollen can stick to. So when the pollen's blowing around, you're looking at allergy season, and you're, coughing and sneezing because of your allergies, then that pollen is just trying to reproduce. And so it's blowing around, and it's going to land on the sticky stigma of the pistil. It's going to go down the style and into the ovary, and you'll have these little ovules in there, which is the female sex cell of the plant, that will eventually create seeds. It's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, just like whenever you think about an animal being pregnant and their belly gets bigger and bigger. Same thing happens with these flowers. This ovule is going to get bigger. This ovary is going to continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And as that ovary continues to get bigger and bigger, it becomes a fruit. So whenever you are eating apples and oranges and things like that, you are actually eating a plant ovary. So you're welcome for that nice visual there. So whenever you're thinking about your apples that you're going to be eating, you're actually eating a plant ovary. Yes, I know that's gross. So here's the parts. The anther and the filament are right here. Some plants have got male and female parts on the same flower. Some are only male or only female. But this is the male part. This is just a stalk. It's going to contain the anther, which is going to contain pollen. And again, wind, insects, different things like that are going to carry that somewhere. And once it carries it wherever it needs to be, then it's going to land on this sticky stigma. It's going to go down the style, down to these little ovules. This whole thing is the ovary. And these ovules will become seeds. This ovary will get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until you have a nice large fruit. The flower is going to die off. But pretty much any fruit type plant is going to reproduce in that way. So the fruit, the lower part of that pistil, the ovary part, is going to have different parts. It's going to have a seed in the middle. The seed itself is going to have three basic parts. It has the coat. That's what helps to protect it. It's going to have the endosperm, which becomes kind of like the food for the seeds. And then it's going to have a baby plant in it. And that baby plant is going to be an embryo. There are some different plant science skills that you're going to want to be familiar with when you're working with plants. One is transplanting. And basically, with this, you are just taking a small plant and you're putting it somewhere else. We do transplanting all the time. We buy these little plugs, which are tiny plants from different companies, and we take those tiny plants and we plant them into larger pots. You go to Lowe's sometimes and you get bedding plants and you transplant those from your plastic container that you bought them in Lowe's out into a flower garden or some larger container. So you just have to be very careful whenever you're doing that you're not smushing. The stems is the most important part whenever you're transplanting something. Um, of course, I said you go to Lowe's and buy your plants. You can do propagation on your own. Anything that has to do with seeds is going to be sexual propagation, because you do have to have the pollen and you have to have the ovule in order to make that seed happen. So anytime you're talking about sexual propagation of a plant, you are specifically talking about using seeds. But there are other ways to reproduce plants. Those of you who are in cohort A and B, you're going to have an opportunity to do this in the greenhouse. Those of you who are remote students, this is something you can kind of do on your own. Asexual propagation is where you're actually taking part of the plant and you're breaking or tearing off or cutting off that part of the plant and you're using it to create a new plant. It basically creates a clone, because you are taking different leaves and pieces of stem from one particular plant and you're spreading them out. And so genetically, they're exactly identical. So if you really want to clone something, start taking some cuttings off of something. Here's some different types of asexual propagation. Cuttings are probably going to be one of the easiest, and we do this in the greenhouse quite a lot. We're going to take vegetative parts, which is basically the green leafy parts, and we're going to use those to help to regenerate itself. We may put a little rooting hormone on it. A lot of times I don't use rooting hormone, which is just a hormone that makes it root faster. So we take a little cutting off of a plant. You can dip it in that rooting hormone or not, and then you stick it in soil and you keep it watered and you have a brand new plant. And so those of you who are going to be coming in face to face will get to do that. Division is where you take a plant and you're going to separate it into smaller parts. We do this a lot of times with aloe plants. We do this sometimes with different types of lilies, and we just actually just go in there and break them apart and create new plants out of the small plants that have grown in there. So division just means you're separating the plants out and putting them in new pots. Grafting becomes a little bit more difficult and a little bit more I guess, skill intensive. You need different skills in order to be able to do it. With grafting, you're actually joining two plants together. An example of this, if you've never heard of them, is a fruit cocktail tree. A fruit cocktail tree, look it up, you can purchase them, has different types of fruit on one tree. It might have started out as a peach tree, but then they grafted a limb on it that was a nectarine, and then they grafted a limb on it that was an apricot. And so you have different types of fruit on the same tree. They have to be somewhat related. Like I had this student one time years ago that said, I'm going to create a banana oak. Well, no, probably not. But, if they're somewhat related, you can put them on the same tree. And basically, you're taking a limb off of one and you're getting it to fuse to another. And you're creating a different plant that has got different parts on it. They do this sometimes with citrus trees, and you might have different types of oranges and lemons and limes on the same tree. They also do that sometimes with apples. So you have different types of apples on one tree. So if you're interested, look up a fruit cocktail tree, and that's basically what we're looking at there is grafting. We're putting two plants together so they grow as one. And lastly is tissue culture. And I've already mentioned tissue culture whenever I was talking about the biotechnology portion. But tissue culture, you're taking a very, very small piece of plant. You're growing it in a sterile area on a sterile petri dish. And as soon as that thing starts to take root, you're going to transplant it over to something like a test tube. Nutrients are in both of them, and once you get them large enough that they can go into regular soil, then you can transplant them out. You can make a lot of plants from just a little bit of plant material with tissue culture. The problem is it does have to be a sterile environment. We've tried to do tissue culture here before. We did not have tremendous success because, I mean, let's face it, high school is not necessarily a sterile environment. But we have attempted to do it, just never really had tremendous success with it. But those places where they do tissue culture on a daily basis, um, it's quite successful, and you can produce a lot of plants from just a little bit of material. Um, this video down here is going to show you a little bit more about asexual propagation, so make sure that you check that out. And that's going to finish us up as far as plant science. And we will have one more unit after this. It will be a short unit. We'll look at some ag engineering stuff right after Thanksgiving, and we'll be finishing up the course after that. So take care and enjoy your Thanksgiving, and I will see you guys soon.